So thank you all for being here tonight. We're going to be talking about the history tonight. There is no opening question because there's a lot of content. So if you are a history buff, you might really like tonight. If you're not so much a history buff, just do your very best to kind of pull out the nuggets. I'll try to help you kind of pull out the nuggets of the things that are the most important to help you to understand the scriptures, because really we're going to be looking at the history as it kind of is playing in the background along the history of Israel as well. So if you didn't get one on the way in, there's some maps back there. I highly recommend this map right here, because this map is it basically, if you were to just read this little thing right here and follow the little lines across the map, you would basically have a history of Israel from a 40,000 foot altitude. It's going to be really helpful all the way from the beginning, from Abraham through his family, all the way into Egypt, and Moses delivering from Egypt, and becoming a kingdom, and the separation of the two kingdoms, and all those things. So it will walk you through that with that map. But there's also a couple other maps back there. So tonight we're looking at the history. Last week it was just an overview of the Old Testament, and then tonight's history. Next week is the people of the Old Testament, and then the following week will be the Messiah. So we're going to be talking about what is the Old Testament, or the First Testament, as I called it this morning. What does it have to say about the Messiah? What does it have to say about this coming, who we now know, looking back, we know to be Jesus? What does it have to say about the Messiah? So this is kind of the region of the Old Testament. Everything that you're going to see from the Nile over here, the green, you kind of see the delta of the Nile here, all the way through this whole area. This is where the Old Testament takes place. And it's interesting, since we live here, to see that it's about the size of the state of Texas. What's interesting is, even more interesting is that even modern-day Israel, including the contested lands, as some of the politics there, Texas is 33 times bigger than Israel. It's like 85 miles across at its widest point, from here to Huntsville or something. So when we're talking about this, really it's a very small piece of land that where modern-day Israel is today. And of course, that evolved over time. But basically, this is where all of the stories of the Old Testament basically happen. Even the exiles, when they took them into exile in Assyria and Babylon, that's all on this map right here as you see it. So we're gonna look at just some of the things that we know about the land. So basically, this is basically Mesopotamia and Egypt down here, and the land of Canaan. That's kind of the three regions that are covered by this map. Canaan, which was that area closest to the sea over there to the left. Later that's called Palestine. It's called Israel, and it's made up of four distinct regions. I'm going to go ahead and shift over here to show you what they are. So. Here along the Mediterranean, you have and you have the Roman numerals 1, 2, 3, and 4. The coastal plain. We live in a coastal plain. Sort of here in Houston. But along the ocean, you have this coastal plain area. In the Roman numeral 2, kind of going up and down here, you've got the hill country places. Then in the number 3, you've got the Jordan Valley, and so you see the Jordan Valley running from the Sea of Galilee up here. Which is a very lush part of Israel. I mean, if you ever go there, you as soon as you see this, you're like, this is really green and lush. And then when you go down to the Dead Sea, you're in the middle of desert and highlands and very arid, dry climate. But that's this Jordan River Valley that goes through here. And then as you go further west, that's the Transjordan Plateau. Jerusalem is in this hill country piece. You see it right there in the middle, just north of Judea. Bethlehem's right below it, just to give you kind of a bearing of where Bethlehem was. You see Jericho up here, just north of the Dead Sea. If you go further north up to the Sea of Galilee, you find places like Nazareth, and a lot of Jesus ministries around the Sea of Galilee. So that just kind of gives you a sense of the topography. God calls in Exodus, I think it's Exodus chapter 3, God calls he said, I'm going to send these people, my people. I've heard their cry in Egypt, and I'm going to send them to a place that flows with, it's a land of milk and honey. And, depending on where you are in Egypt, you might say, yeah, land of milk and honey. If you've been wandering in the desert for 40 years, you might think that. But a lot of this climate is very dry, very arid, very desertous, hilly kind of place. So it's not exactly like like you've just kind of wandered into, the Garden of Eden. You would have had to have been wandering in the desert for 40 years to really think that this was a land of milk and honey. So again, there's the map there. The climate's generally, give or take, it's generally around in the 60s, depending on what part of the country that you're in. Certainly in the day that we're talking about, water was a challenge, continues to be a challenge in many parts of the country. Of course, along the coast, much like here, it has its rains because they're close to the coast. But those central hills where Jerusalem was, that's they get less rain, although when they get rain, they sometimes will get these downpours. And then just 60 miles east of there, you're talking full, Arabian desert. So one of the things that's interesting to note is that Jerusalem is, between 2,400 and 2,600 feet above sea level. So anytime you see in the scriptures where it says, we're going to go up to Jerusalem, that's because you had to go up to go to Jerusalem, right? It was literally on the hill. When Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount says, a city on a hill cannot be hidden, right? He's speaking of something that they would understand. They knew exactly what he was referencing. He was referencing Jerusalem. Jerusalem's 35 miles from the coast, and it's about 15 miles west of the Dead Sea, which is 1,200 feet below sea level. I think, somebody tell me, I think that's the lowest place on earth. Is that right? Anybody know this? It's one of the lowest places on earth below sea level. So, and it's very salty and dead. That's the name. So, so the civilization. So we're talking, kind of in this history that we're talking about. This is the middle and the late Bronze, and then the early Iron Age. Certainly, it was a rugged existence. Again, water was a struggle. They made their living and their lives by agriculture and farming, things like olives and grape production. They also, a lot of shepherds, as you might imagine. Certainly we see that a lot in the scriptures, but goat, sheep, cattle. We know that David was a shepherd, for instance. We know that the angels appeared to shepherds. There was a lot of shepherds in the scriptures. And of course, things like pottery and weaving. And that was kind of what their civilization, just a high view of their civilization. So when we look into the prehistory period, so when I say prehistory, you're talking things before 2000 BC. So we don't have a whole lot of written history from 2000 BC, so that's why they call it the prehistory period. And basically in that prehistory period, we're talking about, in the Bible, we're talking about stories from Adam and Eve through basically Noah in Genesis. So that's, as you're reading some of those kinds of stories, those are all, they fall into that prehistory period. The geography of that history that we see in the Old Testament is just general parts of the Middle East, of Mesopotamia. For instance, we do know from that part of the scriptures, we know that after the flood, the ark ends up landing on the mountains of Ararat. So we peg that today as in modern day Turkey. In Genesis chapter 10, there is a table of nations. So in Genesis chapter 10, what we find is, so Noah saves humanity, right? Ark, animals, the story, lands on Mount Ararat, say that 5 times fast. And after that, he comes off the ark with his family. He's got 3 sons. And in Genesis chapter 10, it lists his 3 sons and then all of their children that goes from there. And so you begin to see it. I hope you'll, if you have time, you can read it this afternoon, this evening. But it reads, it's basically just a list of who these people were, like, Shem and Ham and Japheth. They each had these many sons, and those sons had these sons, and they became these peoples. So there is this kind of listing of the nations that you see in Genesis chapter 10. we see that if we look on this, and this is one of the maps that I think that I gave to you, the purple are the descendants of Shem, the Shemites, as you know, and I haven't done a word study on that, but I'm thinking that Semites and Shemites are probably very related. But we actually see the listing of the Semites in the previous chapter. So the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, descend from the family tree of Shem, listed in Genesis 10, verses 21 through 31. You got Ham in 10, 6 through 20, and then Japheth in 2 through 5. So this is kind of what happens. This family is saved from the floods, and then they stay in that area, but they begin to spread out over this area. So the age of the patriarchs. So if I were to say to you patriarchs, and we're talking about the Bible, could talk to me about who you think who are the patriarchs when we talk about them in the Old Testament? Abraham is one of them, absolutely.
Moses.
Isaac is one of them. Who else? Elijah's a prophet. Moses is not. He comes after that. So yes, it's the first. It's the first 3 or 4, and it's really the accounting of the beginnings of the tribes. So once you get to out of the tribal period of the 12 tribes, you kind of left the patriarchal period, and then you do get into Moses, and you do get into the prophets and others. But so Abraham is the first one. We talked about him last week. He is the one through whom God chooses and creates a people through Abraham. Abraham, if you go and do this, I will make you. I know you're really old, and I know that you're past childbearing years, but I'm going to make a family out of you, and that's going to be a blessing to you. So Abraham is the first of the patriarchs, and then Abraham has sons, but the son of the promise was Isaac, right? You remember that story? God, says, okay, now you have this son, but now I want you to. What was he asking him to do? He asked him to sacrifice him. So Abraham plays a cosmic game of chicken with God, and God says, I want you to do this, and Abraham goes and does it. I always find it interesting when I read that passage that Abraham continues to say that God will provide the ram, right? That God will, and so you almost wonder. One of my seminary professors really pointed that out to me, and he said, you almost wonder, is this really a cosmic game of chicken? Is Abraham going to sacrifice his son, or is Abraham going because he trusts God enough to provide, the sacrifice? And so anyway, it's a beautiful story. Of course, right at the end, God says, "Stop! Don't sacrifice your son," and He does provide a ram, just as Abraham said that He would. And so you have Isaac. Then from Isaac, you have Jacob and his brother Esau, right? Jacob, Esau. Their names in Hebrew mean hairy and grabby. Jacob and Esau. Jacob is grabby, and Esau would have been hairy. So that's literally what their names mean. And actually, they're twins, and actually, they. Remember, Esau is the firstborn, and Jacob is grabbing onto his foot as he comes out. So their names meant something back then. And of course, Esau was the hunter. He was a man's man. He was hairy, and then the other guy, and then you got Jacob. So anyway, so you got Jacob is the patriarch, and then he has Joseph is one of his sons. That's right. And he has all the sons, and there's the story of Joseph in the coat of many colors, and dad plays favorites, and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
When was Abraham?
Like what years were Abraham?
How long ago?
That's a great question. I'm not sure it says on any of the stuff that I have here.
400 years. Just plus or minus 10 years is good.
I mean, sometime between 2000 and 1500. I would guess nearer the 2000, right? So
2000 BC.
So basically, the word patriarch just means, this is a male-dominated society, right? So it means father ruler, or something like that, father ruler. And let me get back up to the slide. So God makes covenant through Abraham, you start that story through these patriarchs, and actually, well, we didn't finish the story of Joseph. Joseph, Jacob, eventually, and you'll see it used interchangeably in the Old Testament. The name Jacob and the name Israel are interchanged. So Jacob becomes Israel, meaning the nation of it. It's also this is how the nation becomes a nation. So he becomes Israel, and his sons become the tribes of Israel. And so anyway, but how does the Joseph story end? So anybody remember that story? Joseph gets sold into slavery. What happens? He comes to power in Egypt, right? He gets thrown into jail, gets out of jail. He rises to prominence in Egypt. And how does he rise to prominence in Egypt?
God's grace.
You what?
Save them from drawbridge.
It was the dreams, right? The dreams. Yes, he was able to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and one of the dreams were about 7 years of plenty and then 7 years of famine. Well, that 7 years of famine ends up doing. How does that play into the story later? It brings his family to Egypt. So from in that 7 years of famine, his father and his brothers all come to him now, because he's now in Egypt. He's second in command in Egypt, and they come to him, and they're looking for provision. And long sordid story, but basically he ends up forgiving them for selling him into slavery, and he ends up giving them provision and actually settling them in Egypt. Well, why does that matter? What happens? What's the next big?
Slaves.
They eventually become slaves. So that's kind of what we see here. So in Egypt, they end up settling in Egypt. Now, we don't actually see the Hebrew people mentioned in Egyptian history until I think it's like 1220 BC. And in 1220 BC, there was a pharaoh who was the son of Ramses I. Ramses I, most historians would agree, was the pharaoh at the time of the Exodus. So his son, I have to look this one up because I don't know this one. I had to look this one. His son was Marnipta, and he was the son of Ramses. And in 1220, he does this. He basically does a military campaign, and on an inscription in granite, the Hebrew people, the Israelites, are mentioned as one of the conquered peoples. So this is the first time we actually have an historical record of the people of Israel, interacting with Egypt. Their Exodus story would have happened before that. Now, there's no reason to believe that they weren't there. We certainly know that there were Semitic people in Egypt, and there were other foreigners. And there was a time that we know where the Egyptian Egyptian leaders called these people Habiru. They called them. They were landless aliens. We don't want your kind here. Was kind of the way that they thought about these foreigners living in their land. So we do know from history that the Egyptians began to fortify their northern borders. They built walls and fortresses, and then they eventually required a labor tax, which is probably what we know then with the Hebrew people in Egypt. This probably coincides with the time of the oppression that Moses is then called to help them exit from. So, and during this time, they're not really a nation. They're just kind of a tribal people. They're just people that are related to, they're related. Their family, their families are family, that kind of stuff. And so they're related, but it's not really a nation. Eventually, Moses gets called by God at the burning bush, right? And God says, "Look, I've heard their calls. I want you to go, and I want you to free them." Moses says, "Why? Why would you call me? Go find somebody else." God says, "It's you." Moses goes and frees them there from Egypt. So now, eventually, those tribes do become a nation under the God that we call God. They called Yahweh. And they basically, we talked last week about these moral laws in the Old Testament and these other kind of ritualistic laws that set them apart from other peoples. And then they now, what do we know about the Hebrews once they leave Egypt? What do? Do they go straight to the Promised Land? They wander around for 40 years, so they become nomads. basically in northern Sinai. And so, during that time, Moses is the leader. Joshua is kind of his second in command. Eventually, before they go into the Promised Land, Moses dies, and Joshua leads them across the Jordan. But they migrate out of Sinai into the Moab desert, just west of those Transjordan highlands, which I showed you on that first map of the 1, 2, 3, 4. It was the 4. It was the farthest over to the right. And they go in, they're set to claim their land, the land that God had promised them, but they were outmatched. The people of Canaan were in the land, and the Canaanites were there. After all, it's called the land of Canaan. And they were a civilized people. They were a little bit further along in their development. They were settled, and they were fortified. So now we have Joshua. Again, Moses dies, Joshua leads. And they do have some impressive victories, but eventually, but even those were kind of fleeting. They would have some ups and downs. This was a very tumultuous period for them. And again, they're still kind of tribal. They don't have a central government. They're led and legislated by judges at this point after Joshua. So you have Moses and then Joshua, and then you have these judges. And then the Philistines begin to come in, and they're also organized, and they're an invading people, and they begin to conquer the land of Canaan. And Israel kind of gets, they kind of get forced off to the side. And when that happens, that, among other things, caused these tribes to say, hey, we want to organize. And we see in Scripture that what they actually say is, we want a king like all the people around us. We want all these other nations, they have kings, we want kings too, And so that's what they ask God for, and God, as I think I said last week, God says, look, I'll give you a king, but if you get a king, it's not going to be what you think. They're going to send your children off to fight in wars, and they're going to make you work their land instead of your own, and it's just not going to be what you think. They said, we still want a king, and God says, great, I'll give you a king. So the first king was? King Saul was the first king, and we talked a little bit about him this morning. He starts off fine, but his disobedience, and he was a little bit crazy. God ends up, saying, okay, time for another king. So he goes from Saul to David, that we talked about this morning. And then, of course, Solomon is one of David's sons. And a lot of, it's not as simple as saying Saul, David, Solomon, because you really need to read that part. There's a lot of, as I said this morning, after David's his sin with Bathsheba and the murder of Uriah, all those things, it really cost him his kingdom in many ways, and it cost him his family. And so there's a lot of struggle to get to where they get. But Solomon is the last king of a unified Israel. So they, during Saul and certainly under David ruled them when they were at their highest influence, their highest military power. And they were unified still as a nation. Under Solomon, upon Solomon's death, they divide into two kingdoms: a northern kingdom, which is still known as Israel, or also known as Assyria. Not Assyria, Samaria, and then the southern kingdom is known as Judah. So when you start hearing those terms in the middle of the Old Testament, you'll know that one of those is referring to the northern kingdom. One of them is referring to the southern kingdom. Now, the northern kingdom is the bigger of the two. There's 10 of the 12 tribes go with the northern kingdom. The other two stay with Judah. I didn't go through all these things, but Solomon is the one that David defeats the Philistines. He dominates. He really creates them into a kind of a regional empire. Jerusalem becomes the capital of this nation, and he brings the ark to Jerusalem. And under David's leadership, there is this evolution of Yahweh worship, right? So books like Psalms and the worship life of the people of the Hebrew people is evolving during this time. Solomon is the one who finally builds the temple, and and certainly Solomon known as the wisest man who ever lived, those kind of things. But he really was opulent. When Jesus in the New Testament in the Sermon on the Mount says, even Solomon in all of his glory didn't have anything on these lilies of the field. When he sang that, Solomon had a reputation for just being extravagant. And the way he had all that wealth was he taxed people hard and he worked people hard, and it made him mad. And again, that was one of the contributing factors to the split of the kingdoms upon Solomon's death. So, and this is in that 1050 BC to 920 BC, during this period of the monarchy. So in 920, you have the split, the 12 tribes split. 10 go to the north, 2 go to the south. Within 100 years, both of them are conquered peoples, and they're weaker than they were when they were united. In 722, so the northern kingdom falls first. The northern kingdom falls to the Assyrians, and those 10 tribes are dispersed throughout the Middle East. And the Assyrians actually moved into Samaria, which is the land where the northern kingdom was. And I want to see, I think I've got a... So the Assyrian Empire is, I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's the lowest one here. It goes kind of around there in the middle, and so they were hauled off into captivity. The northern kingdom was, and then eventually, about 150 years later or so, the Babylonians come to town, and they start. There's this. They're kind of vying for power in the region with Egypt and Assyria, and eventually Babylon conquers Judah, and they are also so. There's 10,000 Jews that are hauled off into captivity to Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar. And it was their cream of the crop. He hauled off they're educated, they're wealthy, they're royal folks, they're any of their craftsmen and their leaders. They hauled off. So in this exile period, all the Judean exiles were settled into one place in Babylon. Solomon's temple was destroyed. The first temple was destroyed in 586. Many were assimilated into the Chaldean culture. Eventually, Cyrus of Persia conquers all of the Middle East. And like I said, this is really, this map here, if you didn't get one of these, make sure you get one on the way out. But this map really helps you kind of walk through all of this stuff, because you're probably not going to remember all of this stuff. I have a hard time remembering all of this stuff in terms of exactly when it happened. But this map really helps you, and it shows you, for instance, it shows you that up here, this is where Assyria is, and everybody was hauled up in here and never came back. The people that were taken over into Babylon, which is a little bit lower, they eventually did come back, and they came back, we know, during, who rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem? Anybody remember that? Nehemiah. So they came, when Nehemiah was alive, he goes to the king and he says, "Hey, I want the walls around my city are broken down." Now, the king lets him go back and do it.
Reunite with the people who were not taken to Babylon.
They went back to Jerusalem, and there were still people in Jerusalem at the time, but they had kind of let the city fall into disrepair because all their best and brightest had been hauled off other places, and they were just disorganized. And
so they didn't call themselves Judeans.
At some point, at different times, they do. Yes, the people of Judah, yeah, they would have. Is that me? No, it's not me. So let's see, what else? What else do we want to? Anyway, I hope that this is really helpful. If you can look at these 11 things and picture where all these things happen, you'll have a pretty good sense of what happens throughout the big story of the Old Testament. Basically, Cyrus, when he conquered, he didn't conquer for political reasons. He conquered for religious reasons. His view of the world was there's this struggle between good and evil, and he basically he saw his life and his military power as being trying to play a hand, for this on the side of good, right? So he's, so when he the things that he does, the conquering that he does, he's doing not to just get more powerful, but to be on the side of good. And that's when he orders the Judeans to go back from Babylon to Jerusalem. And not all of them did, but some of them did. They did, many of them went back, and of course Nehemiah was the one that led them, and they had God's favor and had his favor to put the wall back up. And so at that point, they become more of a theological state. They're not really a power. They're a people united by culture and religion more than anything else. They don't really have an army. They don't really, they're not self-determining or anything. And Persia dominated them for 200 years until Alexander the Great conquers Persia, and then Judah becomes a vassal state of the Greeks. And then, of course, that makes way for the Romans, and of course the Romans are who's in power by the time Jesus comes on the scene. So. Okay. So, questions about that stuff, about history? Yes, sir.
So when it was hauled away, it was like hauling from Dillon to Texarkana. And go back. Yeah, forward. Right.
Probably wasn't even that far. Yeah, it was probably not even that far. It may be from Dallas to Texarkana or something. I mean, it's, maybe Wichita Falls. I don't know. Yeah. So, yeah. Any questions? Any other questions? I mean, basically what you see here is, this was a time of great, until really the Roman Empire, which brought a lot of stability in a large part of the world. This was a very unstable time with, smaller states rising to power and conquering for a while, and then somebody else conquers them. And so, I mean, all of this, like I said, all of this happens in a space that's about that big. So all of it happens because, over here you got Babylon, up here you got Assyria, and over here you have Egypt. Kind of north up here you've got what's modern day, maybe Iraq probably is like Mesopotamia on the north end of that. So, I mean, all of this that we're reading, all it happens in Texas is a big place, but on the world scene, it's a relatively small. So these are all kind of mid-size, kind of empires that are more regional powers than they are world powers, until you get to the Roman Empire. The Greeks also, but to a larger extent the Romans. Sean, were you going to ask me something? And make it an easy one.
So when you say Babylonians, so I'm thinking like when Turkey, it's like the Ottoman, like Istanbul, like all the sultans and all that. Is that who the Babylonians are? Like the whole sultan situation.
You would be. I could lie to you, but I choose not to.
Is it Babylon where present day Iran is?
I know it's where Iraq is.
Did you have a picture that showed the different retirees? Didn't you have a slide that showed we pointed out the Assyrians that they had like a bunch of different circles on it? Not that bad.
So you can see Babylon over here, and you can see Assyria up there. But yeah, there's one more of these.
The other map that you handed us.
That one right there.
Well, that one.
So the Persian Empire is the biggest, and it's the one that goes widest over here and back up through Macedonia.
The Hittites are in Turkey.
Yeah, so this is Turkey here, right? Yeah, so Hittite would be where Turkey is.
No.
No.
Babylon.
And the Babylonians are right here, just right on the Persian Gulf.
It sounds like there was one ethnic group and they kept conquering each other.
Well,
And
certainly.
taking slaves and taking some of the slaves 1,000 miles and then returning the slaves 70 years later.
I mean, certainly, if we go back to this, and we realize that all of these people across Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Jordan, Israel, and Egypt, if they're all related to Noah, then you would say that they're, that's not an incorrect characterization.
That's why they're fighting, because of family.
They're family. There you go. That's very true.
That is sad but true.
Okay. Anything else on questions? I know I went through that really quickly, but I wanted to give you guys some time as well to. I want you to see some of these things happening in Scripture.
I don't understand how they could be nomads in the desert for 40 years, and they were less than 100 miles from where they wanted to go.
God said they couldn't go into the tribe until they were all gone.
That's right.
Until all of the ancestors were gone, they couldn't go into the
All of
promised
them.
land. Well, which is because that was the golden path.
Have you ever been like a big thicket in the forest? There's no maps, no guidance, no nothing. You're just wandering around. You can wander around in the big thicket for years. And you don't know anything. Or in a desert even. I mean, if you don't have no maps. And
There aren't very many trees in that part of the world.
Oh, but I'm just saying, it's the same thing with the desert, though. You just, you don't. There's no direction.
40 years is long.
I know it is. I know, but still. Yeah, are you on foot?
Who is it that said that even back then men wouldn't ask for directions?
Oh, no, that's recent.
Oh, okay. So here's what I want us to do. I want you. We're going to take just 3 or 4 snapshots from the Old Testament. So I don't want you just to see this history from like a history book kind of thing. I want you to see it in the Scriptures itself. So we're going to divide into. I've got 4 different scriptures, so we got to at least have 4 different groups because I want you to read them and I want you to report back what's happening. But one of them is so I need at least 4 groups. If you're a group 5, if you're a 5th group or a 6th group, then just double up on one of these. But all right, we ready? All right, so again, you've kind of heard the lecture part of it, right? You heard here's the history professor giving you all the dates and the highlights. Now I want you to hear the biblical side of it, so that we can. I want you to. The more times you can understand, the more times you can hear and actually with your own mind recreate what happens, the more likely you're going to be able to open up 1 Kings and understand what the heck's going on. The more likely you're going to be able to open up, Jeremiah and understand what he's talking about.
This is already helping.
Good. So, all right. So you guys had the first group. So tell me what was your scripture, and then what did we see happening in your scripture?
All right.
Yeah, you did a good job.
Okay. So we have Deuteronomy 34, 4-12. So it began with somebody speaking to Moses. I'm not sure, the writer, it could be, okay. He says, see, this is the land that I promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I've delivered my promises, basically the message. Then Moses dies, and then Joshua, son of Nun, puts his hands on Moses and says a prayer in front of the whole tribe, and basically performs a funeral. And he says some nice words about Moses. This is the greatest prophet that ever lived. He stood face to face with God. He performed incredible acts, miracles and such. And
Okay. So from the history piece of things, this is the transition from Moses to Joshua.
Yeah.
And what does Joshua do after that? Was that what you guys read? Did y'all read Joshua? Okay, good. So Moses dies, and what does Joshua end up doing? He conquers Jericho. He conquers. He's the one that leads them into the promised land, into Canaan. So Moses is the one that frees them from Egypt, and he leads them around. They wander because of their unfaithfulness, their unbelief, and then eventually he dies, and it's Joshua who brings them into the land of Canaan. They cross the River Jordan. That's an incredible story too. Just he has them walk into the river, and it's some cool stuff. You just read it. But Joshua is the one that actually leads them. So this is the transition between Moses and Joshua, where God, with Moses and Joshua, God is really the direct leader. God says do this, and Moses and Joshua do it. Okay. So, and what were you guys reading? What was yours?
Samuel.
First Samuel,
Okay.
not further last.
Okay. So between Joshua and the kings, who rules Egypt? I mean, who rules Israel? The judges. If they, I mean, again, they're still more of a loose coalition of tribes, but they are ruled by judges. And so talk to us about, recap what you guys read.
Well, the people asked Samuel to give them a king. And Samuel spoke to God, and God said, what they do, they should be aware of what a king does. He makes slaves, he imposes taxes, he takes your firstborn children, he takes a tenth of your income. And he told them that. He told the people, and he says, oh, we still want a king because a king will go to war and then we can conquer our neighbors and whatnot.
Okay. So this is the transition from the judges into the period of kings. We already said who was the first king? Saul was the first king. Who was the second king? Who was the third king?
Solomon.
You see, you guys are good. You were paying attention. And they were the three kings of a unified Israel. Okay, and after Solomon, what happens?
The Assyrians come
The
by.
split. All right. So is that where you guys picked up?
No, we actually have where David's other one.
Okay, do that. Read that. Tell us what's going on there. Don't read it to us, but tell us what's happening there.
God did Mark David, and they were the king, and he rated on his son before him, where's he on his son? He looked at David, and that's what it was. Basically, what it tells us is he looked at the heart of David, he had a plan. You don't necessarily have to understand the plan, you just have to work the plan.
Also tells you that the youngest might not be as apt to have, kind of set in stone or, be, as knowledgeable as the others, so people know what God instructed him to do, so.
Yeah.
Being the youngest child, Joseph was the youngest,
Mhm.
so it really kind of tells you that God can mold him and make him into a great leader.
Absolutely. Yeah, and of course, and we talked about that this morning in the sermon, that one of the interesting things about David is that at the same time he's called a man after God's own heart, and this is the same guy who then commits adultery and murder. So, you have to wrestle with that. Like, what does it mean for him to be a man after God's own heart? I don't think that's what God meant, So, but yeah, there is but certainly David, even after those things, because he repents from those things, and even after those things, he's still thought of. And again, the lineage of the Messiah comes from his line. He's still thought of as the greatest king in the history of Israel. And so anyway, there's a beauty and a brokenness to David, as there is to all of us. And with me, yeah, it certainly there's a beauty to being reminded that we are not. God does not. Our story does not end at our lowest moments. That's beauty to me. Okay, so David gets anointed. He's the youngest. He becomes the second king of Israel. What did you guys have?
First Kings, where Solomon is building places to worship other gods. He has wives who worship other gods, and he builds these, and so God becomes angry and tells him he's going to take away his kingdom, that because of his love of David, he's not going to take it away from him, he's going to take it away from Solomon's son.
Okay. Sorry, my son is calling me from my office upstairs. Sorry, I can't talk right now. Okay. I hope you're okay.
So out of respect for David and his covenant with God, God decides that he's going to separate the kingdom, but not do it until Solomon's gone. And I can't pronounce the guy who follows Solomon,
Rehoboam?
Starts with an
It is, yeah. Somebody turn off the light in the offices. Noah's scared. Okay. So, but he'll learn. Yeah, and one of the interesting things about that particular passage is that it helps to explain a lot of things that we see in the Old Testament that we don't understand about God. So, for instance, why does God say to Solomon, or why does God say to all of them, to the people, don't take wives, to the men, don't take wives from all the countries around you? Why does he say that? Because they worshipped other gods. God had a.
They will influence you.
I have a question. Solomon, he's supposed to be the wisest man, and he's got 300 wives.
Yeah.
Maybe that's why he's wise.
I'm just going to leave that there, Bob. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to say anything about that because you're going to get me in trouble. But one could question his wisdom, yes. But God had specifically said, don't take these wives who worship foreign gods. They will turn your heart after their gods. And God had chosen the people of Israel. Remember, through Abraham, God's chosen the people of Israel with a very specific purpose. Their purpose is to be a part of the redemption of the world. So keeping them from just worshiping every god that's out there was high on God's priority list. And so Solomon has these wives and concubines, and they do indeed turn his heart after other gods. And again, that's when you see the kingdom begin. After Solomon, as he said, the kingdom splits into two. All right. What did you guys have?
2 Kings 7, 1 through 20. Yeah, little chapter.
Okay.
Do you want to take a step, please?
Take a stab.
Alright, so this was Samaria was being besieged by the Arabian army, or Arabians army. This is when the 4 lepers are outside the city and decide to go and surrender to the Arabian army. And when they go, the whole camp is deserted because the Arabian army thought that they had heard a massive army that said, look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and the Egyptian kings to attack us. So everybody's at war right now, I guess, fighting each other. So then they go back and tell Samaria, tell the king, and they go and investigate, and all the food and everything is there. And that's why the price of flour and barley basically plummeted, because they had a massive influx of barley.
I think I gave you the wrong scripture to read. Which is awesome.
We didn't know how to fit in with the rest of it.
I wanted you to answer the question why the price of flour really went up. And that is the. What did I give you? 1 Kings or 2 Kings?
2 Kings.
Okay, it was probably.
So yeah, the reason that the price of flour went down so much is because all the flour and barley was left there from the
They didn't have the guys.
All right, now I got to find out. What was it? 2 Kings.
I'm sitting here listening.
And you're wondering why you're
How did I read like that?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the chapter, it talks about the barley and
Well, no, it was all in chapter 7.
That is funny. Okay, well, I gave you the wrong, because what I was trying to give you was the scripture where the people are hauled off by the Assyrians. So, by the northern kingdom. And that would have made so much more sense, because it was a pivotal moment that we had already spoken about. So, I'm glad we captured that on camera today. You guys have a nice time. I'll correct that later. Anyway, but you guys did a great job. I just want you to know. That's true. That is true. So after Solomon, the kingdom's divided into 2 kingdoms. What are they called? Northern and southern. Judah and Israel or Samaria, right? And the northern kingdom gets hauled off first. And then the southern kingdom gets hauled off. About 150 years later, they get hauled off into Babylon.
So, the Israelis or the Jews
Yes, they yes, the 10 and the 2, and they eventually,
That wasn't a social thing.
Yeah.
yes.
See, the Jesus at the well, the Samaritan woman, knew everything about all that because had all that history. And they just didn't talk to them about Southern part, yeah.
And certainly there's a lot of things. I mean, when you look at if you do read some of these sections about the Northern Kingdom, for instance, they ended up wandering off into they worship, other gods and other things. So there is more to the story than just divided kingdom. But they have a high holy place at Dan and Bethel, and so they end up anyway they walk away from God in some other ways as well, which also contributes to why they get conquered. But what we hope for is that you guys would just have a general idea of kind of what happens here, so that again, and did I give you the timeline? This timeline? Did I give you this?
Last one.
And the only difference this week is it's got them broken into the different ages. So the prehistory, Adam all the way close to Abraham, and the age of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Now they're in slavery in Egypt, and then eventually you come up in Egypt in the wanderings. You have Moses and Joshua. Moses dies. Joshua leads them into the land. They take the land. They occupy Canaan. Hey, we want a king. That's the monarchy. That's Saul, David, Solomon. And then there's Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and you got the northern kingdom, you got the southern kingdom, the 2 kingdoms, and then the 2 exiles and beyond. And so that kind of gets you up to, and of course the prophets are writing, all the prophets are writing here. The major and the minor prophets are writing, around the split, and the exile, and the post-exilic period, and that gets you into the end time of the Old Testament and into the beginning of the New Testament. And that's why in 2 weeks we'll pick up what did all these prophets have to say about the coming of the Messiah.
So how many people were there in Judah? Is it like 2,000?
Well, depends on whose numbers you believe, because if you look in some of their the size of their nation, the size of their armies, they would say they were huge. I mean, they were, I don't know what all the numbers were, but you can go and look at, there were this many tens of thousands of soldiers. So I don't know that historians agree on how big their actual numbers were.
Israel today is like 3 million people.
Yeah, I don't remember. I actually looked up their population today, but it's fewer than the number of people that are in Texas. It's like 17 million fewer than the number of people in Texas or something crazy.
So, like this Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, I'm sorry to miss this. Are those books, were they written down at that time in some fashion, or how did that work?
I think those books, unlike Genesis, where these are oral stories that are passed down and then eventually written down, I think most scholars would agree that sometime around much closer to when they actually happened, they were written down. I don't know that anybody can put an actual date on when they were written down, because just like we've said, we don't have any of the original manuscripts. But I think most scholars would say they were written down much closer. The gap between, the Genesis stories and all that stuff. We're talking, some of them thousands of years and some of them several hundred years. So the stories of this, if Moses wrote those, then he wrote them while he was alive, in theory. So they would have been a lot closer to when they actually happened. Okay. We're getting there. It's good. I like to hear, because again, this is the most intimidating stuff. You open up a book and you see all these names, and the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the exiles, and what the heck does that mean, and why does this matter to me, and all those kind of things. So some of this stuff is the most intimidating stuff. If you can get into this and understand, again, from a 40,000 foot view, then at least the Bible can start to make sense to you, especially the Old Testament. And then again, we'll look next week about the people, and then we'll look the following week as what is the Old Testament? How, really, as Christians, we see the Old Testament, everything in the Old Testament pointing towards Messiah. So when we say that, that really the point of both the Old and New Testament is Jesus. That's how Christians really see that. We see really starting with creation and the fall. That's pointing towards Jesus. The adoption of a people and creation of a people through Abraham is pointing towards the blessing of all nations through that covenant with Abraham, which we believe is pointing towards Jesus. So, and you see that as you start looking at the prophets, you see some of those prophecies and those things that are mentioning the coming Messiah. So we view that scripturally as Christians. We view the Old Testament, a lot of it is pointing towards Jesus coming as this ultimate act of redemption.
I always liked it because it gives me an idea of real people in action. And they're good, they're bad, and Jesus, God still, like when He guided the people through the desert and stayed with them and all that stuff and gave them food and took care of them. I mean, God showed His love to a bunch of people that probably didn't deserve it.
Certainly did not. Nor do we, right?
And He eventually sent Jesus.
It's one of the arguments.
I mean, they have the same faults that I do, and
Absolutely.
and God's always been with them and guided them and kept them.
It's one of the arguments for the authenticity of the Old Testament is that God, that the writers that God inspired to write, they wrote down warts and all of these people. Most legends, it's the good stuff. This is Abraham. He's a liar. This is David. He's an adulterer and a murderer. But these are also people that God can use. And oh, by the way, He can use us too. Like, we don't deserve it any more than they did. And so, again, there's something really endearing to that. But it's also one of the things that I think is it's one of the arguments for the authenticity of that. If people are writing those just to make their culture look good, they just would take out all the bad stuff and they would just talk about all the good stuff, and they don't do that.
And He never abandoned them, no matter what.
He never abandons them. It's true. Can I pray for us? God, thanks so much for this day and for these friends and for your word that is still speaking to us today. God, I'm thankful just that people are willing to come and just tackle this stuff and jump in. I pray, God, that we're understanding some of the big picture stuff of what you were writing about, so that we would just be less intimidated. We'd be more willing to open the book up and read it. And even when we didn't understand everything, we would try to understand what we could, and we would find people to ask the questions that we didn't understand. And we just trust you, God. We want to know that you're still speaking to us today, and we want to learn the lessons that you're trying to teach us today. We are so glad that you are still pursuing us even today. And we love you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.